Good morning, everybody. It is great to be with you today. I hope that you are all doing well. Throughout the year of 2024, as many of you are well aware now, we are attempting to emphasize the need that we have for Christian fellowship. That we build relationships with one another for the sole purpose of joining God in His redemptive plan for the world to take the gospel to all nations. And one of the ways that we're trying to emphasize this is every month we read a text together, and this month we're in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 5 through 11. Let's read that text together. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time He may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on Him, because He cares for you. The story is told of an old man who'd gone to go live with his son and his daughter-in-law because he had nowhere else to go. The old man blinked a lot, and his hands tended to shake. And so when he'd go to eat, sometimes he'd bang his spoon against the bowl. Sometimes he'd miss his mouth, and sometimes he dribbled on the tablecloth, much to the irritation of his daughter-in-law. One day, after a particularly challenging time with dribbling, daughter-in-law stood up and said, "I've had all that I can take. He is disrupting my right to happiness." And so she and her husband took him by the hand, gently but firmly, led him to a corner, set him down on a stool, and gave him a bowl, and there he was to eat. So every day he would eat from the corner, looking wistfully at the table. Until one day his hands were shaking a little bit more than normal, and he dropped the bowl and broke it, and his daughter-in-law stood up and said, "I can't take it anymore. If you are a pig, then you shall eat like one," and made him a trough, and there he was to eat in the corner. Daughter-in-law and son had a little child of about 4 years old. One day they saw him playing very intently with a couple pieces of wood, and they asked him, "What are you doing?" And he smiled up at them, longing for approval, and said, "Well, I'm working on building your and Daddy's trough for when I get bigger." Well, the daughter-in-law and son looked at each other for a long moment, and cried a little bit, and then went and got the old man from the corner, brought him back to the table, set him in a comfortable chair, gave him a plate full of food, and never was he banished to the corner ever again. If there's one thing this world needs more of, it's respect. Because respect, whether it's the respect we have for those who are older, the respect we have for those who are younger, the respect that we have for any human being, respect reminds us and teaches us that we're not the center of the universe. That the world doesn't revolve around us, and that people don't exist just for our pleasure. In 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter emphasizes the need for respect. The book of 1 Peter is written to the exiles, or as was read for us this morning, those who sojourn in this country. That is, those who are Christians who live in this world, recognizing that our home is not here in this world, but rather that our home is in heaven, that we are strangers in a strange land. But more than that, because Satan is called the god of this world, not that he is as powerful as God, but describes his influence in this locale, we as Christians who serve God are strangers who live behind enemy lines. And 1 Peter is written to express how we are to survive behind enemy lines with our faith intact. And here in 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter emphasizes that if we are to survive this world with our faith intact, we need to practice respect. If you got your Bibles, go ahead and turn to 1 Peter chapter 2. But before you do that, how many Bibles do we have? What a fantastic sight. 1 Peter chapter 2. I want us to begin in verse 13. 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 13. Be subject, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to do good and gentle, but also to do the just. Not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing, when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. Notice verse 17. Honor everyone. Peter first begins by expressing the need to honor everyone. Now, tied up in this idea of honor, which we see throughout this chapter, is the idea of respect. And Peter begins by expressing the importance of respecting everyone. That as human beings, we are to recognize that all people are created in the image of God, and that we are to respect all people because they are created in the image of God. That we're to respect them in the way that we talk. For no unwholesome talk is to exit our mouths, and we are to speak with our speech seasoned with salt. That we are to show respect in the way we speak to one another. That we're to show respect with the kind of attitude we hold towards one another. We're told that if anyone thinks that he is something, he deceives himself. For we are all equally in need of the grace of God. That no one of us is better than everyone else. So we are to show respect in the attitudes that we hold towards one another. And we're to show respect in the way that we treat one another. We're told that we are to do unto others what we would want have done to us. That we're to show respect towards all people because we are all created in the image of God, and everything that we say and everything that we do and the attitudes with which we hold. But notice that Peter draws special attention to the emperor in verse 13. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. Peter seems to express two different levels of respect, if you will, two different types. That there's the respect that we have for all people are created in the image of God, but we also have respect for the human institutions or the authority that exists within our society. And here he highlights the emperor. I wonder what those in the first century heard when they heard to be in submission to the emperor, to obey the emperor. For when Peter writes, Emperor Nero is on the throne. That horrible emperor who would use Christians to light his racetrack by setting them on fire. Who would eventually blame the Christians for the great fire of Rome, and who was by no means a friend to Christianity. And here the Christians are told to be in submission to the emperor, but not just to be in submission to him, but to honor him, to respect him. Not merely to obey, but to respect him in the way that they referred to him, in the way that they talked about him, in the way that they obeyed him. We as Christians, we are to obey the laws of our land and submit to our government. But we're also to honor those who are in office, whether we like them or not. But notice what Peter didn't say. He said to honor, he said to be in subjection to, but he never said to worship. Because if there was one thing Nero loved, it was to be worshiped. In fact, he loved it so much that he erected a statue of himself as the sun god and set it outside his house. Nowhere were Christians told to worship the emperor, for they are to worship God alone. That we are to be in subjection to government. We are to honor government, to respect government, but we're not to worship it. That so long as government does not ask us, does not demand of us to do something that is unbiblical and contrary to God. For example, during the pandemic, there were some governments who came out and said that we should not gather together, that it was illegal for us to gather together as Christians. That would have been a time to do in opposition of what the government said, because it was in direct defiance of what God has said. But so long as the government is not demanding of us something that is unbiblical or in rebellion against God, we are not only to obey them, but we are to honor them. In case you didn't know, there's an election coming up really soon. As we get closer and closer and closer, anytime we go to talk with someone else, anytime we go to post something on social media, we should ask ourselves the question, is what I'm about to say, is what I'm about to post, is it in subjection, and is it honorable? Now, does that mean that we can't disagree? Of course not. Of course we can disagree. Of course we can point out areas where perhaps growth is needed. Of course we can point out areas where perhaps things don't seem quite right. So long as we are doing it with a spirit of submission and a spirit of trying to honor. But notice that submission to government and honoring the government and respecting the government isn't the only thing that Peter addresses. Verse 18. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. Now, every time that we hear the word master, our mind usually goes to American slavery. And American slavery was an abominable act, predominantly for two reasons: because of its permanence and its racial motivation. But slavery in the first century, or servanthood in the first century, wasn't exactly the same. For one, it wasn't permanent. There were a whole host of ways by which one could become free, and most slaves were freed by the time they were about 30 years old. Secondly, it wasn't racially motivated, in that one's status was not impacted by the color of his skin. Furthermore, in this particular passage, the word servant refers to a man or a woman who is employed as a household manager. So essentially what Peter is saying here is those who are employed should respect their bosses. That we are to respect the bosses for whom we work. That we're to honor them in the way that we talk about them, in the way that we go about our job. Now that does lead to a question: does that mean that we are to stay employed to the same boss forever if they're treating us poorly? No. But it does mean that the way that we choose to leave that job better be honorable. That the way that we treat authority, whether it be the government or whether it be at work, that we are to treat both authorities with honor and with respect. I suspect that if we went around this room, we could encounter several individuals, probably many of us, who have had times with bad bosses, who have experienced bosses who treated us poorly. And I suspect that most of us have encountered times when we disagreed with the government and thought that it could have been better. So why? Why are we as Christians to be respectful of authority and to submit to authority? Notice what Peter says, beginning in verse 19. For this is a gracious thing, when mindful of God, one endures sorrow while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it when you sin and are beaten for it? You endure, but if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. Essentially what Peter is saying is there's an element of self-preservation. The Christian life is hard enough, is difficult enough with those who are against us. Why be disrespectful to authority and bring down wrath? Peter expresses that if we suffer because of Christ, notice because of Christ, if we suffer for standing firm on the truth, then there is honor and glory in it. But if we suffer because we were disrespectful, well, we got what we deserved. It's an element of self-preservation. But notice what else he says. Beginning verse 21. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were like straying sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and the overseer of your souls. The second reason that we're to show respect is because we're to follow Christ's example. If ever there was one who had the right to stand up and to overthrow the authorities of this world, it was Christ himself, who is the King of kings and Lord of lords. If ever there was one who had suffered unjustly, and that was the moment when he should have rebelled and overthrown authority, it would have been in that moment. And yet, Christ chose to submit himself to the authority and to respect it. And we are to follow in his example. But notice the third reason. Verse 13. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to the governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. Verse 15. Verse 15. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Many of you are aware that I'm allergic to peanuts, which meant that for a very long time I was deprived of one of humanity's greatest treasures, Chick-fil-A. Because Chick-fil-A cooks their chicken in peanut oil. So you can imagine the joy that I had when I discovered that even though they cook in peanut oil, they go through a pretty rigorous process to denature the protein so that it doesn't cause people like me to react. So when we found out that when the revelation had come to us that I could now enjoy this great treasure, it didn't take very long for us to make our way over to Chick-fil-A, for me to grab a chicken sandwich, to bite into it, and be disappointed. Everyone had built up how great this chicken sandwich was in their minds, or at least in my mind. It told me how much I was missing, that I'm not sure there's any sandwich on the face of the earth that could have quite met my expectations. But it wasn't long before I found myself migrating over to Chick-fil-A pretty regularly, enjoying and being able to taste that buttery bun with the perfectly fried chicken. Being able to enjoy those waffle fries with Chick-fil-A sauce. Part of the Chick-fil-A experience is the joy of walking up to the counter. Can I have a lemonade? My pleasure. There's something about hearing my pleasure as opposed to, you want fries with that? It just makes the whole experience so much more enjoyable. Suppose you were to walk in and you were greeted by a rather unruly Chick-fil-A individual. First of all, you might be wondering if you were in the wrong place. But suppose you walked in and you had a rather disgruntled employee who was rude to you. Would it stop you from going back? Well, probably not. We'd probably keep going back and keep getting those chicken sandwiches. But what if every time you showed up, you encountered the same disgruntled, rude employee? It still might not stop you from going back. But it might impact your view of Chick-fil-A. It might make it harder to enjoy that buttery bun. It might make it harder to enjoy the waffle fries. We are a reflection of Christ, for we are his body. And the way that we choose to live impacts how others are able to view and see him. And so if they encounter his body as rude and disrespectful, it's going to impact their view of God. It may not keep them from coming to God. They may still choose to come to God anyways. But our rudeness will impact their ability to see him. So we are to be respectful. But that leads to the question of how? For I suspect that when those in the first century heard that they were to not only submit to, but to respect the emperor, the one who was dead set against them, I suspect that they wondered, how in the world are we to do it when it's hard? How are we to do it when our boss is just a piece of work? How are we to do it when we see the flip-floppingness of those in office? How are we to do it when it's hard? Notice what Peter said. First is to be in the Word. Notice verses 2 through 4. Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, that by it you may grow up into salvation, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. What is pure spiritual milk? Well, it's the Word of God. And now we recognize that we want to go from milk to meat, that we want to grow, but that's the whole point. That as we are in the Word, we mature. And mature Christians do what is hard. That if we are to respect when it's difficult, we have to be in the Word and be growing and maturing. Secondly, we need to be with the brethren. Notice verses 4 and 5. As you come to him, a living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. That we as Christians are being grown together, that as we come together, as we fellowship together, as we encourage one another, we are being built together. The Hebrew writer says that, do not forsake the assembly, so that we might spur one another on to love and good works. To paraphrase, that we might spur one another on to do what is hard. That as we come together, we encourage one another, strengthen one another to do that which is hard and to be mature Christians. We are to practice self-control. Notice verses 11 and 12. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God in the day of visitation. To abstain from passions of the flesh. That is to practice self-control. For as Christians, we are to practice self-control. And as we practice self-control in other areas of our lives, it makes it easier to have self-control in those difficult moments and show respect. And third, to remember who you are and whose you are. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. When it's hard to be in subjection, when it's hard to show respect, that we remember who we are doing it for. That we might not be doing it for our boss who we don't like. We might not be doing it because we like the government, but we do love our God. And because we are his, we choose to obey what he's told us to obey. In World War II, there was a group of individuals known as the Coastal Watchers. And they had two primary jobs. The first was to observe enemy movements. That they would make their way to an island held by the enemy. And there they would set up and watch the enemy's movements and report back to the Allies what was taking place. But they had a secondary function. And that was that they were to watch the skies and watch the seas and find any pilots who'd been down and any sailors who had been stranded before the enemy. Our task as Christians is to watch for those who are struggling, to watch for those who need aid before the enemy can get there, to live behind enemy lines and seek to serve our God. And if we're to live behind enemy lines and survive with our faith intact, we have to practice respect. Perhaps you're here today and you want to begin a relationship with the one who loves you most. Or perhaps you're here and you haven't been living as you should and you want to make a change. If there's any way we can assist you, won't you come as together we stand and sing.
Yield not to temptation, for yielding is sin. Each victory will help you some other to win. Fight manfully onward, dark passion subdue. Look ever to Jesus, he'll carry you through. Ask the Savior to help you, comfort, strengthen, and keep